Afternoon. Welcome to our second Tiny Tom Talks. What's in a weed? And we're here with Tom Simpson, our research ecologist. I'm going to let you introduce the topic, but just want to let everyone know that our Tiny Tom Talk series is more of a podcast style. So we're going to have a little bit more unscripted after Tom gives a very short presentation style thing. So feel free to ask questions as we go. Take it away, Tom.
Welcome. There we go. So we talked about remnants last time. We're kind of at the opposite of the ecological spectrum today. We're going to talk about weeds, and there's a lot of overlap in considering those two for an ecologist, particularly an ecologist like me who works in an agency that practices ecological restoration. So there we go. Now this is the Jackie wouldn't let me have this as the title slide, but I snuck it in there when she wasn't looking. Defining a weed. I mean, the weed is a word we use very commonly, but when you start to think about it, it's got a lot of different definitions. Like a weed is any plant growing where I don't want it to. That kind of makes common sense. A weed is a plant that takes advantage of disturbance. It's very much an ecological kind of definition of that. You know, if we go in with a bulldozer and mush up in a place and grind up the plants that are there, weeds come in initially. And a weed is a non-native species, which is a slightly, probably not used often by people outside of the conservation community, but very, very commonly, that's how we think about weeds from the standpoint of ecological restoration. Not our concept of weeds might be broader than just non-native species, but certainly includes those. The problem is that all these have sort of run into these common sense problems when you actually start to think about it. Like a bur oak seedling that grows in my lawn is a weed, and one that grows in an oak savanna is not a weed. Or prairie plants that thrive in a fire landscape are weeds because they really require this periodic disturbance to maintain themselves. And weeds like common reed and canary grass that really form pretty stable, at least stable on a human timescale. I've watched them and they just stay the same year after year. And they do that without any disturbance. And so they're not weeds, which doesn't make common sense either. And weeds can be non-native species, which works very well, maybe for you and me if we're interested in conservation and ecological restoration. But for someone who's got a rose bush and peonies in their garden, those are hardly weeds. So my point being that the definition of a weed, while it's a very useful word, it's wholly dependent on the context and human purposes that we bring to a situation. Weed is a useful term, but always only in a situation where the people in that situation understand one another. What we're going to do is think about weeds from the standpoint of conservation and ecological restoration. After all, this is a conservation district. That's whom I work for. It's what I've been doing for the last 20 years here. But even that doesn't really get us out of the weeds, so to speak. No pun intended. Because conservation can be a lot of different things. I picked out these three because I think they collect most of the opinions that I've run into in the literature today. The one in the upper left, we value those species, ecological restoration, we value those species in combinations or communities that were part of the history of the place before us. I mean, that's why do we know there were prairies here? Well, that's part of the history of this land before we came here. Oak savannas, prairie fens, all those are part of sort of observation of what was here before European American settlement. On the other side, in the upper right, is actually a very common idea. It's common in the general public, and it's common within conservation, not so much in the Chicago area, but certainly international conservation and conservation in other parts of the United States. In particular, if you really want a good intro into novel ecosystems ideas about conservation, you should read Rambunctious Garden by Emma Maris. I read that and wrote a short review of it just a few years ago. It's a fairly recent book. And that is conservation really is about wildness. And that is the degree to which a place changes outside of any intentional human control. So the goals of conservation aren't any particular community, but rather that people should let go of all control of an area and then let nature do what nature does. And the third one on the bottom is a common theme in conservation, really, since the word conservation was coined early in the 20th century. And that is we value nature for the store of resources it contains, and we manage nature to maximize the yield of those resources. So maximizing timber yield, water yield. It could be wildlife if you're managing in a situation where you're managing for hunters, you're managing for wildlife populations, game populations. That's taking a resource point of view on the world and picking out individual things. You might, I think I used the term last week, a reductionist or reductive approach, looking at the ecosystem as a collection of things, picking out those things that are useful and managing for those. So from a standpoint of ecological restoration, a restored prairie is good and an out-of-control weed field is bad. But from novel ecosystems, it's the exact opposite. A carefully restored prairie is just a garden. I mean, it's just a garden people make. And the out-of-control weed field is good because that's where nature is really on its own and doing, so to speak. I mean, I may criticize that, but from the standpoint of novel ecosystems theorists, that's where nature is really doing what nature does. And conservation would say that neither the prairie or the wheat field are particularly useful for society. And I mean useful in the sense of giving us resources that we need for society. And so neither one of them might be the goal in utilitarian view. So each of these would then think of weeds in a different way. We're going to look at this ecological restoration approach again, because that's really how we look at the natural areas of McHenry County as an employee of the Conservation District. And to do that, I want to talk. I've used this before in presentations, so if you've seen it before, we'll go through it again. How do we think about weeds? How do we think about change in nature? And we'll get to the idea of weeds here in just a second. And so I want you to imagine going back. I've asked my supervisor, Ed Collins, for a time machine. I don't know how many times he's never budgeted for one, so I can't actually do this experiment. But if let's imagine we go back 300 years and we go to an area of 5,000-10,000 acres of prairie, and we go there and we eliminate the vegetation in one acre. That's that center brown square there. We eliminate the vegetation in that 1 acre. What happens when we stand back and we fast forward a few years with our time machine? We find out that prairie influences seed, prairie organisms, prairie animals. The fire of prairie begins to invade that disturbance area. We might even think of the prairie plants as weeds. They're invading a disturbed area, and eventually that turns back into a prairie. You'll notice that square had no innate tendency to be a prairie. It was simply surrounded by prairie and prairie influences, and so it couldn't really turn into anything else. It turns back into a prairie. But let's think about that again. This is I think a common mistake in how we think about nature. Now we're going to go back and we're going to look at that 1 acre, but we're not going to see anything around it. All we're going to see is that 1 acre. What we see is a prairie, and then we see a disturbance, and then we see an area where at least some plants are coming back into that little square, and eventually it turns back into a prairie again. So we could make up a story that was like this, that a story that you had a disturbance, you eliminated all vegetation, and then eventually it went back to this, what's being called in this diagram. This is one of dozens and dozens of diagrams you can get if you Google the term ecological succession. This has been so much a standard in how many people think about change in nature. But I want you to think about this square. This square really had no innate tendency, even though if we go back, we say a disturbance, recovery, and then it's a prairie again. It's like it knew what it wanted to be, but it didn't really, because all it did was become its surroundings. So, and the reason that's important, and you think this is just some little tricky thing that Tom thought up, picking at some established theory and as if I've come up with some novel idea, but I want you to think about, this is actually very important. Think about where nature is today. And this is a picture where nature is today, that a prairie, let's say that's that same acre of prairie we visited 300 years ago. It still happens to be here. It's a little remnant in a weedy cultural landscape today. Well, what's the situation? Well, a weedy cultural landscape, the influences of that weedy cultural landscape are constantly entering the prairie from all sides. And slowly, if you don't do anything, it slowly changes it into a weedy landscape again. Or I should say, changes it into a weedy landscape, because what else can happen? It's surrounded by influences of weedy cultural landscape. So that approach, that change will naturally convert it to a weedy landscape. This is important because this is the situation we're in today. This is the why we need to do ecological restoration, because the natural tendency is not to go back to some pre-European settlement past, but rather to turn into whatever's around it. So in living with, let's go back. This is the subtitle of this talk today. What do we do if Phragmites is here to stay? I want to think about this, that we never rid the landscape of weeds. I mean, the larger landscape in which natural areas occur today will always be weedy, at least for the foreseeable future. Maybe it's some ideal vision of the future in 200 years. It's not that way, but I think for any time on a human time scale in the future, it's going to be full of weeds. At least for the foreseeable future, our natural areas will exist in a developed landscape. Which means we can never finish a restoration. How can you finish it if the influences are pouring in from the outside are always tending to change it back into a weedy cultural landscape? And even remnants will require constant monitoring and maintenance. There's nothing, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with our management. It simply means that our management is being done in a context where the influences are pouring in from the outside are always tending to convert that area into a weedy cultural landscape. Is that a bad thing? I want you to think about this, not just in this presentation, but afterward. This is an important question. Is that a bad thing, that we can't fix things forever, that we can't just go out there and do a restoration? We're done, and then we can sign off and it will always be a beautiful prairie? Well, I want you to think about that, because I don't think it's a bad thing. I think what it points out is that restoration, or ecological restoration, is not just an act, it's a relationship. It's a relationship between people and land. It's an ongoing relationship. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing, because it engages people in the practice of conservation. It never ends. And that, I think that's, from a conservation point of view, that's a good thing. Any questions? I'm gonna.
So I have a couple of questions for you, Tom. You can stop
Okay.
sharing your screen. There we go.
Okay.
And just to give folks a little bit of time to think of their questions and put them in the chat, or if you want to unmute later, I'm going to ask you a couple right away. So I thought it was very interesting. Both you and I individually picked a picture of a dandelion. And so let's use that example. You know, is a dandelion what we think of as a common weed, a weed in prairie situations?
Well, I would say, I think the answer to that is yes, but I want to qualify that answer, because something is a weed doesn't mean it's, I mean, there are literally hundreds of non-native weeds in our prairies that we don't do anything about, and probably foreseeable future aren't, simply because they're at relatively low population levels. They don't really serve as a threat to the restoration of most of the prairie species we're after. And so we target only weeds, in terms of management, we target weeds that really prevent the establishment of a diverse native community. You know, I suppose you might fast forward 200 years in this practice and we might get down to the last weed, but I really don't think that's even practical to consider. It would be a weed because it's not really a desirable part of the prairie. It's in the case of dandelions, they really you'll find a dandelion. I used to find dandelions occasionally in old growth hemlock sugar maple forest in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, trees that were 300 and 400 years old. Doing vegetation surveys, you would occasionally find a little dandelion rosette. This was miles from the nearest town, so they were weeds, but they weren't really a threat. So they're really not a weed in the terms of active management, but yeah. So hope that answers the question.
Yeah, so my other question for you before we get into, everybody keep adding your questions in the chat. So we talked about a weedy cultural landscape, but I'm guessing that means, you know, our view of what a weed is changes depending on your background or your culture. So I'm thinking in terms of, you know, like when indigenous people were also lighting fires or doing various things, you know, what was considered a weed when you're managing for a bison herd to be on the prairie as a food source is probably very different from now, I would guess. Or what's your thought on the cultural landscape?
Well, I think when I say weedy cultural landscape, again, I'm using the word weed as a person who's involved in the practice of ecological restoration. And so the cultural landscape surrounding natural areas today is what I was referring to. I mean, I think it's an interesting question concerning native peoples that were here for, 13,000 years, maybe longer. We don't know exactly. The concept of weed, yeah, that would be an interesting. You almost have to ask native peoples how they would think about that. I mean, they obviously didn't worry about non-native weeds because that was not an issue then. People weren't traveling between continents, although they did carry. The evidence at least would imply that they were carrying seed of useful plants around and introducing it in places where it wasn't there before. Kentucky coffee tree is thought to be a good example of that. It shows up in tiny little populations in a variety of places in the Midwest and not continuous populations. And it's known that at least some native peoples use those big seeds in gambling games and other reasons for carrying them around. So I suspect that the issue of weeds probably wasn't a big issue to them, but that would be an interesting question for
And that would be very different in the past versus now too. But I'm going to ask you another question from the chat. So, or maybe more of a comment. I find it interesting that a number of our native plants include the term weed in their common name. I wonder how that influences our understanding of native areas and restoration efforts.
That's a really nice observation because common names reflect the common view of things. I was just talking to, can't remember exactly. It was just a group of people I was talking to about soil, and we have poorly drained soil. That's how the NRCS defines soil that stays wet, or very poorly drained soil if it's really wet. But it's not poor, it's poor to grow corn in. It's a particular point of view that says it's really a part of the same point of view that then says the first step is to drain the land. So again, we incorporate this cultural point of view in the common name, and that's why it's incorporated into the names of native plants, that at least to somebody who was doing the naming, they were troublesome things that were in the way, and so we call them a weed. Yeah, always beware of that in the naming of things. It always reflects a cultural background and a purpose, just as the word, yeah, as I said to begin with, the word weed always reflects a purpose and a point of view.
Another comment in the chat. It seems to me that many of the weeds we have were created for the horticulture industry, and then they became problematic in natural areas. How might you suggest there be a more ethical way of introducing new plants in the nurseries?
Well, that's a long-standing issue. It's one that we have, it's not, I think it's illegal to sell buckthorn anymore. Same with some other noxious weeds. You can't sell them anymore. Of course, once they're established, you don't really need to plant one in your yard to have a problem. The problem is the hundreds of millions of them that are already out there. So we have that. The problem becomes an economic one. Declaring something a noxious weed then takes it off the list of things people can sell, and if something people really want to buy, therefore it's something that nurseries can make a lot of money on. There's a big resistance to declaring an noxious weed, and that's just it's a problem. One could wish it wasn't a problem, that we could just, as natural areas people, we could just give everyone a list of things that we don't want sold anymore, and we could make the change overnight, but it takes time and it's a political issue. So yeah, I wish it were simpler, but it's really not that simple.
That reminds me of earlier this week when we taught the herbicide training session, we were talking about noxious weeds and what's legal and illegal. And in my mind, I go back to my environmental consultant days where we were dealing with not necessarily weeds, but contamination. And you were talking about there are places where something like arsenic, you know, that sounds like a terrible, horrible thing, but there's a certain amount of it that we have a tolerance for in apple seeds, for example, but in large quantities, that can be a problem. So tolerance is kind of an interesting take on weeds. Does anybody want to unmute and ask a question? I'll leave a couple seconds if anybody's waiting for their chance to talk.
Really anything. It could be about a specific weed and how to control it. I mean, I geared this presentation more in terms of weeds in general, but I was just out this morning doing weed control. That was honeysuckle, buckthorn, autumn olive, multiflora rose, the usual list of villains, or at least villains from my point of view, that I was out trying to control this morning. That's just I think it's almost inherent in the human management of landscapes today, is that you have to define what are desirable and undesirable plants, and therefore come up with a definition of weeds and how you approach your work.
All right, I'm getting radio silence from the crowd here, but I do want to point out to everybody, we are posting recordings of these on our @DiscoverMCCD channel. There's a Tom Talks playlist. We have the rest of the mini series is going to be on Thursdays, same time, same place, same Zoom link and everything. So we'll be here next time. We are talking about conservation farming. So we'll have a guest speaker for that one.
Yes, we'll have a guest. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. I know most of you don't know much about our farm program, so that's a good reason for you and a lot of other people to tune in to find out about it next week.
All right. Well, thank you all for hanging out with us. We hope to see you next week.
Thank you.